Ladies and gentlemen, I am so glad to have 160 of you here for our Law Day presentation with Professor John Woodward from Boston University, who has been a great supporter of the VMVLA and has been so generous to do this wonderful presentation for Law Day. So, Professor, I'm handing it over to you, and I'm going to help this person who needs to get logged in.
Well, thank you very much, John. I'm honored to be speaking.
Yeah, no, I've definitely sent you that photo.
Please mute, please mute, please mute.
So thank you. I'm very honored to be speaking to my fellow members of the Virginia State Bar. I'm here in Boston. I have to admit, I was really hoping it would be typical Boston weather today. Dreary, raining, windy. It's a beautiful day. I hope you have bad weather where you are, so it makes this CLE a little bit more bearable. But at any rate, I do want to mention that in the interest of full disclosure, I note that in the promotional material for this continuing legal education course,
both are there.
I'm described.
I mean, I've been in ragtime. And
Actually,
I'm
need
going
to
to ask everybody to mute their mics, please. Mute your mics.
Also, being able to say the N word.
Mute your mics, please.
Instead of being embarrassed about my line.
We've got about 12 people with their mics on. Please mute your mics.
It's unfortunately we can only do one CLE course at a time. It's usually when I teach to my students, when I'm teaching, I usually am the one that forgets that I'm muted. And of course, my students tell me I'm a lot better as an instructor when I'm muted, whatever that's worth. But at any rate, I note in the promotional material, I'm described as a leading expert on the reach and limits of executive power under the Constitution. I think that's what we call.
I wouldn't think it was intentionally hostile.
If your mic is on, please mute. Mute your mic now, please.
But he made an apology in that statement. I mean, I don't know if you've got as far in that article. It was
Mr. Reed, your mic is on. Mr. Reed.
Yeah.
Shorter, please. Yeah.
The one I sent you. And
very short, actually.
Professor, if you want to hand control back over to me, I'll mute these people, but I can't do it while you've got control.
Oh, I understand. Hopefully they'll catch on. But at any rate, I note I'm described as a leading expert. I think that's what we call a little bit of puffery or gilding of the lily. I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on any topic, but I did do national security and intelligence work for the United States government for 30 years. I've spent some time researching this topic, and I currently teach a course on national security law at Boston University. So in today's class, I hope to give you a broad overview of the important events and cases related to this topic. For many of you, this will be a walk down memory lane. You will know these transformational events, the Civil War, the Korean War, and the cases, the Still Seizure case, Dames and Moore, and so on from your previous studies. I'm going to start by discussing our Constitution and what it says and does not say about national security powers. So we know we have three branches of government.
Yeah. So
again, a reminder to people, please mute.
Regular.
Please mute.
The 15, number 15. Regular, is there a matching? Yeah. Okay. 15, yes. Thank you.
Please mute.
Okay, Professor, if you could, you should, if you can see my picture, click on the three dots on my picture and turn the control back over to me temporarily.
Very good. Allow.
I've never had this problem before.
how do I've hit the three dots.
Yeah, just hit
which
the three
command do I hit?
dots on
Make
my
host?
picture and then it should say make host.
You are the host.
All right, I'm gonna
Oh, okay.
see if I can't. All right, everybody has been muted and I'm going to turn control back over to you. I apologize for that. You are muted now, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. I
There
think
you
think
go.
their
Okay.
conversations are a lot more interesting than the one I'm having. So fair enough. So, quick review. These images should look familiar to all of you. We have three branches of government. Constitution, Article 1, the legislative. Article 2 is the executive power invested in the president. Article 3, the judicial power. All three branches have roles to play with regard to presidential powers and national security. We might make the claim that some branches are more equal than others, right? And I'm speaking about
Baby,
the executive branch.
Please mute. Professor, if you click on participants, you'll see an all mute button.
Got it.
you have to go pee pee, Sam?
And then just
Okay,
hit
we'll go
that and
pee-pee
say
again.
yes.
They're coming up.
Got it. Whoops, sorry.
Hey, sir? Okay.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, we'll just put it on this one.
Sorry about that, sir. No, you're good. I saw you too late.
Miss Rothman, please mute.
Aha. I think that worked. I do love the power of technology. So I think I was saying now, all branches are separate but equal, but arguably with respect to national security, the executive branch is more equal than others. Many scholars and stakeholders would so contend. There are many reasons that can be advanced for this claim. I'll just cite three of them. One is the existential in the post-World War II nuclear age. It's really the president who is best suited to act on behalf of the nation, particularly when a nuclear armed missile can strike US shores in a matter of minutes. Another reason would be the practical. To put it very crudely, Congress is simply too dysfunctional to act in a timely manner with respect to national security. Arguably, there are special considerations. The president, executive branch frequently deals with classified information. That's where I spent about a 30-year career dealing in classified information. In fact, the Supreme Court acknowledged this special consideration in the Curtis Wright case in 1936, which concerned a US arms embargo involving two South American countries involved in a war. There, the Supreme Court noticed the secrecy of foreign affairs information and the difficulty of predicting the effects of our actions on international relations makes it necessary for Congress to accord to the president a degree of discretion and freedom from statutory restriction, which would not be admissible if domestic affairs alone were involved. And I would also advance why the president is seen as more than an equal in national security on a philosophical basis. Article 2 empowers the president to act in national security affairs. This is what's called the unitary executive philosophy. We've seen this recently with the George W. Bush administration. Adherents of the unitary executive theory would include former Vice President Cheney and Professor John Yoo. But actually, a point that I'll be making is that I think the greatest adherent of the believer in the unitary executive that the president has the supreme power of national security would be someone we're going to spend some time on today, Harry Truman. Harry Truman from Missouri becomes president when FDR dies. Recall that it is Truman who committed United States military forces to the war in Korea without any congressional authorization. And it was Harry Truman who, using his executive power alone, seized the United States steel industry. That is, to put it in today's jargon, an epic use of national security power. And we'll talk about that. What I'd like to do now is look at the text of the Constitution. And I think what we'll discover is that with regard to national security, the text is not so neat and tidy. It does not delineate clear and obvious lanes for the different branches, okay? I would contend the president and Congress have overlapping functions. Now, we're all old enough to know that the United States has been involved in numerous armed conflicts globally since the Second World War. As a matter of fact, I've been involved in a few of those conflicts, although I don't think there are many of us that are old enough to recall the last time Congress formally enacted a declaration of war. And the answer to that is in 1942 against Romania. And again, is war really defined in the Constitution? The entire Korean War was called a police action by the Truman administration. Well, I would say when over 30,000 US personnel die in a police action, that is a very serious police action indeed. With respect to the international arena, if you look at 2B on the slide, when is a treaty required as opposed to an executive agreement when we're dealing in the international arena? Well, why does this matter? Well, the distinction is important because a treaty requires 2/3 approval of the United States Senate. That's in Article 2, Section 2. An executive agreement does not require such Senate approval. And we'll also discuss this conundrum of habeas corpus, which you see in 3A on the slide before you. At the risk of paraphrasing Chief Justice Roger Taney, if the suspension of the writ is in Article 1, how can the president have the power to do it? Now, as much as I would like to, and as much as you might enjoy it, I'm not going to go line by line through the Constitution. Maybe we are all textualists now, but let's spare ourselves that textualist exercise. You have this matrix in the materials. You can study it. You can do a deep dive at your convenience. I'm just going to point out some highlights. For example, Article 1, Section 5, the secret journal clause. This shows that the founders understood that there would be a need for Congress to conduct what we would call classified discussions. Now, let's think about this for a moment. That should not be surprising, since our founders were, in fact, insurgents, to use today's jargon. They were insurgents against the British Empire, and they were up to their eyeballs in espionage and spycraft. Let me give you some examples. George Washington, the nation's first spy master. Alexander Hamilton was a young staff aide for General George Washington, handling intelligence matters. We have Benjamin Franklin, the father of covert action, who was in Paris getting clandestine aid from France and other European powers to help the Patriots. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these excerpts. You have the reference and you can do a deep dive much as you appreciate. I will call your attention to Article 3, Section 3, the treason clause. This is interesting because it's, I think, one of the very few crimes where the founders went into great specificity as to what would be required for the crime of treason. To read in relevant part, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. And we could ask, well, why such specificity here, where in other areas of the Constitution, we have a lot of vagueness? Again, I think it has to do with the founders' shared experience during their insurgency, during our Revolutionary War, when they all knew the fate that awaited them had the war come out a little differently. So to summarize this for you, I would contend that Article 1 and 2 assign some overlapping functions with respect to national security. Second point I would make is the text is not always precise. The text lacks definitions. For example, what constitutes a war? What does it mean to declare one? And you can think about, well, how would you interpret the Commander-in-Chief clause? Does the Commander-in-Chief clause mean that the president is merely the first general? That's a narrow construction. A broad construction would be that, as the Commander-in-Chief, the president has all military powers not explicitly granted to Congress. The text is not clear on some other important issues. May Congress delegate power to the president? How far can that delegation go? For example, Congress passes a statute that says the president should do whatever she believes is necessary to eliminate the threat posed by ISIS or whatever your favorite terrorist group may be. Some might contend that's a little bit too broad, but that sounds a lot like the authorization for the use of military force that Congress passed in September 2001, targeting al-Qaeda, which still remains valid, despite arguments advanced by Virginia Senator Tim Kaine to the contrary. Okay. And then we have the issue, what if the president takes action and Congress remains silent? Does that congressional silence mean that Congress agrees with the action taken by the president? The last point I'll make in summarizing is that generally in the post-World War II period, the branches of government have generally cooperated with respect to national security. So that's the background and the framework that I want you to keep in mind. And now I want to transition to a president who made extensive use of national security powers. So we'll look at our own Civil War. And this is the reason the war was fought. Does the state have the right to secede? I would note that President James Buchanan, Lincoln's immediate predecessor, felt that the states did not have the right to secede, but he felt that as president, he was powerless to stop it. Unlike Buchanan, Lincoln was not passive in his approach. He was determined to preserve the Union, even if that meant fighting a war and, in fact, keeping slavery. Now, where would you look for guidance as to whether the state had a right to secede? Well, good luck looking at the Constitution. There's not much in there about a state's right to secession. Okay. Now, clearly, the southern states seceding thought they had a constitutional right to secede. And then just something of a historical perspective for you. I'm going to give you two leaders, and you tell me which leader you would rather have in wartime. Now, you could look at this and probably realize that on paper, Jefferson Davis would be one of the best wartime chief executives you could have. But thankfully, it didn't turn out that way. And I guess when I teach my international students here at Boston University, I give them my very quick summary of the Civil War, and I'll share that with you. Here's how I summarize the Civil War from the perspective of the four.
I said no.
This is what I tell my friend. They said no.
Oh,
That's
God.
what he said. He was like $50. I said, yeah.
Mr. Kerr, you've unmuted again. Please
I was
mute.
like, wow. He's making a lot of money
I'll summarize it by what I call the four deaths of the Civil War. First, secession is dead. That issue is solved in the Civil War. Secession is dead. Second, slavery is dead. Third, over 600,000 people are dead. So if you adjust that for the current United States population, that would be the equivalent of more than 6 million deaths. And then fourth, Abraham Lincoln is dead. That's my summary. Let's do a little bit more of a deep dive. Again, I think this is review for you as far as, to put it crudely, we have the Civil War because of issues that we don't resolve in the Revolutionary War. And I would contend many issues that we currently face in the United States today are directly related to the Civil War. I always tell my students, understand the Revolutionary War, understand the Civil War, you'll have a much better perspective on understanding America today, right? And we know that as America expanded westward, settling more territories, bringing them to the Union, different political compromises are tried, right? We have the famous Dred Scott case, where Dred Scott, who was a slave, who had lived with his owner in a free state, Minnesota, before he was returned to the slave state of Missouri, Dred Scott argued that his time spent in a free state entitled him to emancipation. The Supreme Court decided to meet the issue of slavery in the United States heads on. Perhaps they thought they could settle the issue once and for all. In his opinion for the court, Chief Justice Taney, you see in the lower right-hand side of the slide, Taney held that no Black, free or slave, could claim U.S. citizenship, and therefore Blacks were unable to petition the court for their freedom. Moreover, Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. Of course, the Dred Scott decision outraged abolitionists and clearly heightened North-South tensions. This shows the 1859 raid on the armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, that was led by the gentleman you see in the bottom center, John Brown, a fervent abolitionist. You also see artist's portrayal of John Brown, the upper right, in a Christ-like depiction. The lower left shows Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was in charge of United States forces that captured Brown at Harper's Ferry. The photo on the lower right is of a Virginia militia unit, the Richmond Grays. They provided security at John Brown's hanging in December of 1859. And if you look closely at that photograph, one of the militia members is John Wilkes Booth, who 6 years later assassinates Abraham Lincoln. Although this raid failed, this sent shockwaves through the South, and again, contributes to tensions, and Lincoln's election in 1860 as a Republican results in secession. 11 states eventually secede. Here is a map that you see from the period. 7 states initially from the Deep South, joined by 4 others, including Virginia. And if you look at this map, I'd call your attention to the only territorial change brought about by the Civil War was the creation of West Virginia and its acceptance into the Union in 1863. West Virginia had been part of Virginia, and I'll talk more about that. And here is another map showing the United States in 1861 on the verge of war. The border states are very important. Particularly Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. They do not join the Confederacy. And you know, Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. He supposedly said what you see there in the first bullet. Even if it's an apocryphal saying, it's a very good summary. And he definitely did write what you see in the second bullet. Well, why is Kentucky so important? Well, its northern border, and you can see on the map there, is the Ohio River. That is an economic and transportation linchpin for the United States. So Kentucky has great importance. And here, a look at some border realities that you can see. Of course, Maryland, if Maryland goes to the Confederacy, it means the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., is surrounded. Missouri, nexus to the Mississippi River. And Maryland immediately becomes the center of attention because after the guns are fired at Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for the state-controlled militias to come to Washington. Remember, at this time, the Army of the United States is very small, less than 20,000 soldiers. Most of them are in the West, keeping order on the frontier. And by this point, roughly 25% of the United States Army's officer corps has resigned to go with the Confederacy, including Colonel Robert E. Lee, who goes with Virginia.
Professor, can I interrupt you here for just a moment?
Yes, by all means.
Did you want questions from the chat during the presentation, or did you want to wait till afterwards?
I'll stop in about 4 minutes and take some questions.
Okay, so
That's
we've got one question, but I'll just hang on to that until you're ready.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So Massachusetts responds to Abraham Lincoln's call. General Benjamin Butler brings his troops via railroad. Troops had to change trains in Baltimore as they are marching from one train station to another. They are attacked by a Confederate mob. Maryland is a strong Confederate arena, and Baltimore was a strong Confederate city in many, many respects. With respect to the death and mayhem in Baltimore, Lincoln shows amazing restraint. That's what I would contend. Rather than take the issue head on, he diverted troops from transiting at Baltimore, had them transported to Annapolis, which was more Union in sentiment, and from there shipped to Washington, D.C. When the Maryland legislature convenes in the end of April 1861, now they're convening to decide whether or not they're going to commit secession. That's an important meeting for Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's generals urged him to just arrest all the Confederate sympathizing legislators. And they had a fairly good idea who they were. And the loudest voice was that of General Butler. General Butler, who had been a Massachusetts politician. He was a so-called political general. He didn't have a military background, but he understood politics quite well. And his advice to Lincoln, arrest them all. And Lincoln didn't do that. He did have his commander-in-chief at that time, General Scott, on the ready, but he did not make mass arrests. And similarly, later in September, when a legislative session convenes in Frederick, Lincoln shows restraint. Oh, this time he did have 6 of the pro-secession legislators arrested. I want to transition now to Virginia. And I want to talk about the state of West Virginia. So I think this map is important because to me it shows the linkage between slavery sentiments and the Confederacy. So this map shows you the number of slaves in Virginia counties in 1860. So the darker the color of the county, the higher the number of slaves that are registered in that county. And if you look at that map, you see the area that we know as West Virginia does not have much of an enslaved population. And I think that is explained in part by geography, terrain, and climate. As you probably know, West Virginia is mountainous And at that time, it was mostly subsistence farming. In West Virginia, you didn't see many large-scale cash crops. That was more common to the Tidewater. And if you look at the Tidewater, that's where you can see a large number of the enslaved and also stronger Confederate sympathies and sentiments. So when Virginia seceded from the Union, leaders in Western Virginia who were anti-secession and pro-Union decided they would secede from Virginia. And how did this come to be? Well, it came to be with the help of the Union Army. Union General George McClellan defeated a Confederate force at Philippi, which is in the northern part of West Virginia, roughly in the area south of Morgantown, north central West Virginia. Now, it wasn't that large of a battle in terms of numbers of personnel, but it was a very important battle because that stopped any Confederate designs on advancing further into Pennsylvania. And it also bolstered the anti-secessionist pro-Union West Virginians. It also bolstered the career of a young General McClellan because he was a master of public relations and he used the telegraph to make sure Abraham Lincoln knew what a great job he was doing as a general. John Pierpont of West Virginia organizes the pro-Union West Virginians at a meeting in Wheeling, far in the northern part in the panhandle of West Virginia on the Ohio River. That's a very safe place for pro-Unionists to meet. There they declare themselves seceding from Virginia, and Congress, which without the Southerners there, approved statehood for West Virginia. Now, what's interesting, Abraham Lincoln raised the issue of West Virginia statehood at a cabinet meeting, and there were many cabinet members who opposed it. Lincoln finally made what I think is the winning argument. What West Virginia has done is secession in favor of the Constitution. The issue did not get great attention at the day because it came into effect at the same time as Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation. So in a way, that was the major news of the day. Let me stop here and go to John Kohler with questions. Go ahead, John.
Okay, so the question was actually more of a factual one, at least the first one I saw. And it was asking about your slide where you had listed the slave population numbers, and they wanted to know, was that for all of the territories or just for the, I guess they mean the states that seceded?
And that slide on those are for the states that seceded, for the individual states, for the border states.
And that, I think, yeah, that was the only question so far.
And this is my understanding, and some of you scholars might know better, but like, for example, the slide of Virginia that I showed with all the enslaved. My understanding is that was one thing that county governments kept fairly good records of because there were tax implications. So that was actually something that the government tried to track. So the data, I guess you would say, is fairly reliable. But thank you for that question. Again, if you have any other questions, please submit them to Mr. Kohler and I will be happy to address them. Okay. I want to talk now about Kentucky. Kentucky is a divided border state. And remember, Abraham Lincoln knows Kentucky very, very well. The second bullet, you see the governor of Kentucky announced a policy of armed neutrality. What he meant by that was Kentucky would have neither Union nor Confederate military on Kentucky's soil. And that would include the movement or transit of Union or Confederate troops through Kentucky soil. So we could ask question 3A. Well, CSA is the Confederate States of America. You know, you would think, at least we're told that part of the reason these Confederate states seceded was their recognition of states' rights, the sovereignty of the states. So at first blush, you would think, well, given the political philosophy of states' rights, you think that Jefferson Davis would be very respectful of the state of Kentucky's policy on armed neutrality. And similarly, you think that Abraham Lincoln at the center of federal government would not be so sympathetic to the fact that a state is telling the national government, you cannot transit your troops through our territory. Very interesting thing happened. Leonidas Polk, and I guess he has a Virginia heritage in part. He was a graduate of the Virginia Theological Seminary. At the outbreak of the war, Polk resigned his position as a Southern bishop. He became a Confederate general known as the Fighting Bishop. Polk took a very unexpected action. He invaded Kentucky. Polk justified his invasion by citing the preemption doctrine. Now, I think you probably can think back to the Iraq War, March 2003, when we heard preemption doctrine invoked in another context. But Polk invokes the preemption doctrine. He wants to get there before the Yankees do. Well, Polk's invasion caused great controversy. Kentucky governor and politicians are complaining to Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government. They want the Confederate troops withdrawn. But Davis, who we saw on paper, the best qualified wartime executive one could have, invokes the doctrine of military necessity as his justification for preemption, and the troops stay. Since the Confederate troops stay, that is when Union troops under General Grant occupy parts of Kentucky, notably Paducah. Now, I would note, prior to Polk's invasion, both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, were clandestinely providing aid and arms to their respective supporters in Kentucky. In fact, the armaments that went to pro-Union forces in Kentucky were known as Lincoln guns. I want to talk a little bit about the border state of Missouri. And again, you probably know the background, bloody Kansas, because the idea is we'll have popular sovereignty determine whether a state should be free or slave. I want to focus on John Fremont, the Pathfinder, you see in bullet number 2. He's one of the more interesting characters of the Civil War. He never really lived up to what he expected to achieve. He was a publicized explorer of the Wild West, an ardent abolitionist, the first Republican candidate for president in 1856. He was politically well connected through his marriage to Jessie Benton, the daughter of Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton. Lincoln, who appointed many a so-called political general, made Fremont a general and put him in charge as commander of the West, which included Missouri. Fremont did an interesting thing. He enacts on his own authority, without prior consultation with Lincoln, an emancipation order that will essentially free the enslaved that are in Confederate areas in his area of responsibility. Lincoln learned about it through the newspapers. Lincoln is very afraid that this will tip the scale. Missouri will go Confederate. He privately advises Fremont, amend your order so that it's in line with the Confiscation Act of 1861. The Confiscation Act basically would liberate enslaved who were actively helping Confederate forces, digging entrenchments and so on. So very few were freed through the Confiscation Act. But Lincoln wants Fremont to be in line with his policy. Fremont says no, he's not going to do it. Lincoln didn't like that, and eventually Lincoln had it amended. But one could contend, if you want to kick this to the moral level, didn't Fremont really make the right ethical choice? And basically, what Fremont did in 1861 is what Abraham Lincoln is going to do in 1863. Okay. I guess this is the art history portion of the course. This is a painting by George Bingham. It's called Order Number 11. This, in a pro-Southern, pro-Confederate way, captures General Order Number 11 issued by General Thomas Ewing, which caused residents in 4 Missouri counties to have to leave those counties because they were basically safe havens for Confederate forces. And I think next I have the actual text, some background on this. Confederate forces and guerrilla forces are receiving support from these areas. This is how Ewing dealt with it, by forcing the relocation of the people that were living in that area. And I have the actual text here, more than you need to know, but you can see in paragraph 1 the effect this have, causing massive displacement. Again, an action that Lincoln approved. It was very controversial. In fact, this was so controversial. If we fast forward to when President Harry Truman is president, he is from Missouri. Harry Truman's elderly mother came to visit him at the White House. Truman jokingly said to her, "Mom, I have good news. You're going to be staying in the Abraham Lincoln bedroom during your visit." And Harry Truman's mother is said to have responded, "No need unpacking my bags. I will be returning to Missouri immediately." Because as a young woman, she was caught up in this relocation. Again, with respect to national security powers, about 13,000 civilians were arrested by Union forces during the Civil War. Different arguments why. I think one of the convincing ones is they were arrested not because there was a strong central government, but rather the opposite. The civilian apparatus was so poor and inadequate that you had to use the military to deal with issues that came to the fore. With respect to the Emancipation Proclamation, again, a review for many of you. The Emancipation Proclamation gave freedom to the enslaved that were held in geographical areas that were in rebellion against the United States. Did not free all the enslaved. And it was an extraordinary use of executive power, specifically the war power, the right to seize a belligerent's property during the war. And that's a map showing the enslaved that were impacted by this. Lincoln waited until he had a victory to announce this, because he did not want the Emancipation Proclamation to feel like it was a losing proposition. So he announced that after Union forces won the Battle of Antietam. Now, with respect to habeas corpus, this gives us one of our famous Supreme Court cases from the Civil War period. Is it the president or Congress that has the power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus? Part of this is a textual analysis. Well, the suspension clause is found in Article 1. Article 1 deals with legislative power. Also, the English king did not have the power to suspend habeas corpus. And the argument would be the framers would not be likely to give the American president more power than the English king enjoyed. Lincoln, of course, suspended habeas corpus, and he made an argument of necessity. And you can see it summarized there. Ex parte Mary Mentani, writing an opinion, disagreed and said Lincoln could not do it. Lincoln dealt with this in practical terms by ignoring the decision. Subsequently, Congress enacts a statute that gives the executive power to suspend habeas corpus. And actually, Merriman probably did deserve to be held in Union custody at Fort McHenry because he was a Confederate activist. Okay. There were other cases where habeas corpus was suspended by Secretary of War Stanton. Then, of course, in ex parte Milligan, after the Civil War is over, that's when the Supreme Court put some limitations on when a civilian goes before a military commission versus when a civilian goes before a civilian court. And yes, Milligan was also a Confederate actor operating in Indiana. Quickly, I just want to set the stage for the still case. We're advancing now. We're going to fast forward about 90 years. We're going to go to the Korean War. You can see the Korean War begins on the 25th of June, 1950, when forces from North Korea pour across the 38th parallel. That had been the boundary between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea, what we call North Korea, and the Republic of Korea or South Korea. This invasion was what I would call the first military action of the Cold War period. This is a hot war. Truman immediately and without any congressional approval commits U.S. military forces. By early July, U.S. ground forces had entered the war on South Korea's behalf. From the perspective of the United States, during this tension-ridden Cold War period, the Korean War was seen as a war against the forces of international communism. If we look at invocation of war powers.
Professor?
Yes, sir.
I know that you wanted to move on and set the stage for the second half, but we are getting close to the break time, and I did have a few comments or questions from the first half.
Okay.
First of all, someone who says, as a West Virginia native, they want you to know it's pronounced Philippi, not Philippi. And
I always get that mixed up. Okay. And I will say, with respect to the West Virginia native, I have been to Philippi. I have been there on the heights of what's now Alderson Broadus College, and I've seen where the Cleveland Battery was deployed. So thank you.
Okay. This was a question, was one reason why Virginia seceded and joined the Confederacy because it did not want Union forces passing through Virginia on the way south? I can actually answer that one. Yes, that was a significant consideration for many of the secession delegates.
Mm-hmm, yes.
But then a more substantive question for you. Someone says that you mentioned in your outline about General Grant's order expelling Jews, and they wanted you to comment on that.
Oh, yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes,
if you want, after you answer that question, I think it's almost 2:50. We can go ahead and take that first break.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for raising that question. That was General Grant. Was he in what was called the Western Theater? The Western Theater around, he's physically around Vicksburg. The Grant issued that order because a large number of Union forces, there was a large civilian infrastructure that supported those forces, supply and so on. They were called sutlers with S-U-T-L-E-R. Some of those sutlers were Jewish. Some of those sutlers in general engaged in practices Grant didn't approve of, loaning money, selling goods illegally, and so on. Grant overreacts and issues a ban on Jews in his theater. It is very, very quickly rescinded, and Grant apologized for that action. He, in my opinion, showed general remorse for the mistake, the very serious mistake that he made. But that's the story behind the order expelling Jews from his theater. It's really one of the very sad marks on his career. And again, something for which he did show remorse for his very, very poor behavior. Would you like us to take the break now, John?
Yeah, I think go ahead and take the break now. If you would, again, click on the three dots on my picture and turn control over to me.
Very good.
I will run the little, I guess you call it intermission video.
Okay.
And when we come back, we will finish up. I did want to make a couple of quick comments. Number one is thank you to everybody who donated in support of Professor Woodward's selected charity, the Madison County Rescue Squad. We have raised over $800. I don't have the final total because we had a couple more donations come in during the last few days of registration, and I just frankly haven't had time to update it, but I know it's over 800.
Yeah, and I thank you very much for that as well.
And I did post a link in the chat, and I'll post it again for those who might want to go ahead and make a donation at some other point. So have you turned control back over to me?
I think you have it because I don't see the,
No, it
anymore.
says you're still host. So click
What
on
do
my
I-
picture on the 3 dots and make me host.
Sorry, very good. Yeah, I do thank you for your donations. My wife and I have a place in Syria. That is not Syria in the Middle East, but Syria in Madison County. And they have a volunteer rescue squad, and that will be very much appreciated. You should have control.
No, not yet.
It's getting there. Yeah, I think you should have it now. Good to go?
This will stop sharing the other screen. Yeah, okay. So there we go. All right, I'm going to start our little video or whatever you want to call it. And when that's done, we will come back and finish up this very informative and entertaining CLE. Obviously, we are not in the pre-show, but this is the video I wanted you all to see with all of the advertising in it.
John, are my questions coming through?
Okay. Welcome back, everybody, for our second half starting very soon. I see I've got a lot of chats here. Let's see here. Can you not make the presenter a co-host? I have not been able to figure out how to do that. Maybe I'm not hitting the right button or something, but maybe I should. How long is the break? Well, it's about 10 minutes. We're starting back at 3 o'clock. I guess I should have responded to that earlier. And let's see here. This is a fantastic session. You know, this is a law day session. You have a typo in your CLE solutions or something like that. Yeah, no, undoubtedly I do. I need to go through all of those little commercials and fix them. We're talking about the Civil War. I'll also add that my father's family owned quite a bit of land on which the Battle of Brandy Station was fought in Culpeper County. Not sure if it was owned then or purchased later in the 1800s or 1900s. Okay, how did Congress get around the fact that in order to accept West Virginia, secession Virginia, they had to tacitly accept Virginia's succession? Well, I think the professor correctly explained that it was a secession in favor of the Constitution. The real truth of the matter is that Virginia, to this day, has never recognized the secession of the Western counties, as Congressman Morgan Griffith would be happy to tell you. You want to lend the motivation video? Okay, that's fine. Anyway, Professor, can you unmute? And somebody says I can share with you, but I don't see that. I see make host, allow to multi-pin, whatever that is, and I can remove you on Zoom. Yeah, I don't, maybe multi-pin is what that is. But anyway, I'm going to make you host again and turn things back over to you, and perhaps I'll Google making someone co-host.
I'm very happy to share with you, John, anytime. And I think Virginia.
Wait a minute, at least I just shared to you by mistake. Okay. Can you unshare? Can you?
Oh, you disabled it. Okay. What do you need me to do?
Yeah, what happened was you went full screen just as I was doing it. Oh dear. Let me see. Elise, are you there?
John, if you do
I'm right here. I just can't figure it out. I see the recording.
So click on my picture and you'll see 3 little dots.
Your picture is full screen with me.
Okay, go to a view where it's not full screen, I guess.
Is that a share screen if I go to full? No, that's
no,
not
no.
that either.
Up in the upper right where it says view,
View.
go to gallery
Speaker
view.
Gallery view.
And
Okay.
go mouse over to my picture, click on the 3 dots and make me host.
You really want to be in charge.
I want to make the professor, the other professor in charge. Sorry.
There you are.
I am now host.
There
And
you
I
are,
am now
sweetie.
making Dr.
Okay,
There
but while
we
I'm
go.
here, I still don't get the logic of this. You can only accept people that want to join you if they weren't previously part. So it seems to me that even though it was ratifying part of being in the Union, that implicitly by accepting West Virginia, which I know from my bar exam,
It was actually a question on her bar exam.
Yes, it was.
Which
I'm not
sounds
that
like
old. It wasn't a Civil War bar exam. but I want to be very clear. You can only accept new members and new people if they weren't previously there. So I think that the reason that it didn't get attention was, as you said, there was the Emancipation.
I happen to know enough about what went on at that period. I am a Civil War buff. And there was actually a faction in West Virginia that what they wanted was for the U.S. to recognize them as the legitimate government of Virginia. And there was some concern about that. I think there was a thought.
Okay, but here's the thing: you can only be accepted as legitimate government if the other government left.
Well,
so that you're implicitly accepting secession. That's why they had to do something else, even though they accepted these people.
My answer to you is it was a civil war and they were doing things on the fly. And let's let Professor Woodward get back into his presentation.
Yes, in the face
back
of,
over to you.
In the face of existential threat, right? And I think there were several of Lincoln's learned cabinet members making that same argument. Let me see if I can share slides.
You should be able to share again now. Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah, so we'll talk about what's in shorthand has become the Still seizure case. And there's some contemporary coverage of the event. So in April of 1952, that Sawyer in the caption refers to the Secretary of Commerce, Charles Sawyer, who at President Truman's direction seized the nation's steel industry with an executive order. The steel industry at that time was a massive employer, very important to the economy of the United States. Maybe it would be the equivalent of President Biden seizing Silicon Valley today based on inherent Article II powers. So why did President Truman do this? Well, at the time, internationally, let's first look at internationally, negotiations to end the Korean War were deadlocked and United States troops are still fighting there and dying there. Domestically, steel industry leaders had rejected the wage stabilization boards. That's part of the federal government. The wage stabilization board had made a proposal for settlement of a very bitter labor dispute in the steel industry. And the United Steelworkers Union had called for a walkout and strike starting on April 9th, 1952. So President Truman feared that a strike would cause an interruption in steel production, which would imperil the defense effort. You need steel to fight a war. Now, the president did an interesting thing. Instead of invoking statutory authority that he had at his disposal, specifically under Taft-Hartley Act, he could have sought an injunction. He could have invoked seizure prediction provisions under the Selective Service Act of 1948 or under the Defense Production Act of 1950. Truman acted on the basis of what Department of Justice attorneys assured him were his inherent Article II constitutional powers. I would also note as an aside or a sidebar, I think that Chief Justice Fred Vinson, who is Truman's pal from their years in Congress together, also told Harry that he had the authority to seize the steel mills. And I would note this is for John Kohler, who loves legal history. John, you have to remember this. Fred Vinson is the answer to the legal history trivia question, who was the last Chief Justice of the Supreme Court nominated by a president of the Democratic Party? Truman made him the Chief Justice. That's a long time ago.
And
Well-
that is why John Roberts is probably going to hang on as long as he can until at least the next 4 years. But he's a young man. He's actually about my age, so I shouldn't make jokes.
I will leave political editorializing out of my presentation, but I agree with John. So this next slide, I try to show you, this is the dissenters' point of view. It's a 6-3 vote. Can Truman seize the steel industry based on inherent Article 2 powers alone? 6 votes, no. 3 votes, yes, he can do it. I'm looking at the dissent because I think it highlights the case. Why did Harry Truman seize the steel industry? The practical answer: he had to maintain the flow of steel for the war effort and at the same time avert the inflation that would be threatened by higher union wage demands. The legal answer would be inconsistent goals were set for him by Congress with respect to military procurement and wage stabilization laws. Per the dissent, because of the execution of inconsistent laws, it was apparent that vested a measure of discretion in the executive. So you see the argument captured by the dissent: inconsistent laws, Military Procurement Act, which means we have to have steel to fight wars. We have the Wage and Price Stabilization Act, which means we want to keep inflation to a minimum. Possible outcome number 2, if the president says, I'll enforce the Wage and Price Stabilization Act, that means no inflation. But in the process, we violate Military Procurement Act because we don't have steel to fight the war in Korea. If the president goes with possible outcome number 2 and says, we'll let the steel workers make more money, we will get our steel, but we're going to violate the Wage and Price Stabilization Act because we'll have inflation. Okay. And again, that is the perspective of the dissenters. Now, this is the Supreme Court that decided the case. I think the best insight into Supreme Court jurisprudence was given to us by Justice Robert Jackson, who is on the court, one of the more interesting Supreme Court justices. The best insight into Supreme Court jurisprudence: the Supreme Court is not final because it is infallible. It is infallible because it is final. Now, visually, that court does not look very diverse. They all kind of look like me, a bunch of old white people, old white men. But in a way, they did have some diversity in different ways. Specifically, of the 9 justices, 2 were academics. Felix Frankfurter was a noted professor at Harvard Law, William Douglas at Yale Law School. 4 had held very high positions in the legislative branch. 3 had served formally as either the Attorney General or the Solicitor General of the United States. In one way, they were not diverse. They were all appointed by Democratic presidents, 5 by FDR, 4 by Harry Truman. Seemingly how times have changed, right? 7 of them had executive branch experience. And what I love most, 2 did not graduate from law school. Reed and Jackson. I think Jackson had studied for maybe 1 year at law school, took the bar exam. I don't think that might be a record we will not see again on the Supreme Court. And here's a summary of the Supreme Court decision by leading expert, Dr. Marcus. She's written the classic study. It's the fact that the Supreme Court actually took this decision and made. They took the case and they made a decision, okay? And they did bring Truman into line. So let's go into a little bit more detail on that. So basically, if you look at the opinions that are written, I think there are 6 different ones. The Supreme Court examined factors that could give the president the authority to seize the still industry. And I put them in 4 buckets for you, 4 categories, 1 through 4. And again, it was a 6-3 vote. I guess I should have given you a spoiler alert. It's a 6-3 vote. The Supreme Court found that the president did not have the inherent authority to seize private property in the absence of either specific Article II authority or statutory authority given to the president by Congress. So in dissent, we had Fred Vinson, who, remember earlier, before the case was brought, had told Truman he could do this. I think they had a looser view of ex parte contact in those days. And he was joined by Reed and Minton, okay? So what I'm gonna do in the next 2 slides, I'm gonna dissect the opinions of the justices using these 4 categories, okay? And again, I'm not gonna go into copious detail. You have the matrix. You can go over the opinions. You can correct my mistakes, but I hope to give you the general flavor of how the court is thinking. Because I think if you just say, hey, it's a 6-3 vote, this was a slam dunk, I think it's a little bit more subtle and nuanced than that. Okay. Again, that's the dissenter's view of the case. Just keep it in mind. Now, to thoroughly confuse you, I have 2 slides. On the vertical axis, I have the justices. And on the horizontal axis at the top, I've got my 4 buckets. Can the president do this? And what they looked at under the president's commander-in-chief powers, under his emergency powers, given congressional acquiescence, or is there some kind of aggregate authority? Okay, so I have 2 slides. There you see the rest of the justices. And again, horizontal axis is the same. And I've tried to color code this. When I was done with this slide, I felt more like some kind of an engineering program manager, I must say. But I think it breaks it out. And again, you have these slides and you can visit them at your leisure. But I would say basically, I have Justice Black, Hugo Black. We call Hugo Black, had been a senator from Alabama. FDR appointed him to the Supreme Court. Hugo Black and William Douglas are in blue because in their analysis, they really did not see any factors that could give the president the authority to do this. So I put them in blue ink, but I think you could say that they took a very black and white view. The president cannot do this. And if we go to the next slide here, you'll see the dissenters I have in a deep red color, because their view is, yeah, the president can do this. And these are just excerpts from the dissent that I've categorized across those 4 areas, those 4 factors, right? The commander-in-chief link, you see if you're looking at the dissent, that a work stoppage would jeopardize and imperil national defense. Extraordinary times. And then what I've done with the rest of the opinions is I've highlighted in bright red parts of the opinions by the other justices that suggests they're not completely unsympathetic to the use of presidential authority, but this particular case doesn't present strong enough grounds for finding it, okay? So here, for example, you see Felix Frankfurter. Now, as I mentioned, Felix Frankfurter was a professor at Harvard Law School. It's actually just across the river, quite literally from me here. It is said that Felix Frankfurter was the smartest person in the room, and he wanted to make sure that everybody in the room knew that, right? Clearly a powerful intellect, a lot of tension in the court. He and Hugo Black couldn't stand one another. In fairness, it probably didn't help that Black had belonged to the Ku Klux Klan in his younger years in Alabama, Frankfurter being of the Jewish faith. But if you look at Frankfurter's opinion, again, very scholarly. If any of you read Frankfurter's opinions, he shows in those opinions he's the smartest justice on the bench. He talks about this idea of how the president's action is not sufficiently limited in time in response to an emergency. In other words, if you look at Truman's executive order, he didn't have an end date where he said the still industry would be returned to its private owners. It was rather open-ended. So Frankfurter notes, well, it's not sufficiently limited in time, okay? Frankfurter also talks about a gloss on executive power. And he comes up with actual historical examples where the president did take action without having a statutory authority for doing so. And Congress acquiesced in that, which put a gloss, okay? Now, you'll also note, and Frankfurter's not alone on this with respect to commander-in-chief powers, many of them cite there's no formal declaration of war, okay? Now, really, and I don't mean to be flippant here, and I've been involved in several wars since World War II, but it's almost quaint to us to think we would have a formal declaration of war by Congress for anything, because we've not seen it in our lifetimes, right? But to these justices, it's 1952. World War II is not that long ago. They all remembered it. Many of them were heavily involved in World War II, in senior positions in government. So for them to cite there is no formal declaration of war, it's not as strange as it may appear to us, because we have grown up as a generation where Congress doesn't seem to do that anymore. They don't formally declare war, okay? If you look at, I'm going to come back to Jackson's opinion because that's the one that's most often cited. Here you see Burton sympathetic to the idea of an emergency power, where he could foresee catastrophic situations, but the Korean War doesn't meet that standard, okay? Here, even Clark leaves some wiggle room, talking about how you have to do a very intense analysis of the gravity of this situation. So if you summarize that, there are arguably, if the situation were a little different, 6 votes that would say there might be some kind of inherent emergency power the president could have. And maybe you get 5 votes where the president gains authority by congressional acquiescence. Okay? Again, it's just a matter of looking at these opinions. My point would be, it's not as easy as saying 6-3 slam dunk, these justices reined in Harry Truman. There is sentiment, sympathy, dare I say support for what the president had done. It's just that this particular case does not rise to the level. And I would also make the point, it is believed by many scholars that the justices had information not contained in the record that actually said that the dire shortage of steel predicted by a strike was not as dire as the Secretary of Defense, Robert Lovett, had claimed in his affidavit. They might have been a little suspicious, I guess the word would be dubitante, of the government's claims that immediately there would be a shortage of steel and US troops would be imperiled. I want to spend some time on Justice Jackson's concurrence, because this is the one that is frequently cited. So again, this is Robert Jackson. Jackson, very famous. He had been the Solicitor General. He's appointed to the Supreme Court. You might recall he took a leave of absence from the Supreme Court to be the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials for the Nazi criminals, okay? It is this analysis of Jackson's, this becomes very famous, his so-called 3 zones, his 3 zones, you see them there. I think his concurrence has become famous because it categorizes executive authority in an understandable and accurate way. This categorization is used in subsequent legal cases and in political analysis. And now we play a little bit of, I guess I'll use the correct sports metaphor. We're going to play a little bit of inside baseball with the Supreme Court. I'm sure my good friend John Kohler knows the answer to this. Who was a young law clerk to Justice Jackson during the Still seizure case?
Excuse me?
That would have been.
I'm pretty sure it was William Rehnquist.
Let me handle about money.
No, she always does
Every
that.
day.
She doesn't have no
We
clue.
spend money earlier, right?
We have
So,
some people that you
the
need to
plan
mute
that-
too, Professor.
Yep, I see that.
The one that we
Sounds
plug
like
with
they're,
the Saturday, we
Let me
spend it
figure out how to
already,
do that.
okay? So we have no,
$30.
we have no budget. for
And
today.
you
That's not,
and your team.
that's not. We have no budget for today, okay? Guess what, though? We
There
have
we go.
one
Their
more budget
conversations-
for Amway's cake. We have to take Amway cake tomorrow from Costco,
I
okay?
don't have to buy it from Costco.
I think that did it, eh? I must say,
So did I get it right?
their conversation is much more interesting than ours.
Did I get
Yes,
it
you
right?
did.
Okay.
Yes, you did.
Ten-
John Kohler is a force to be reckoned with when it comes to legal history trivia. And I know you're going to double down on this one, John.
Oh,
Who was a young law clerk to Chief Justice, at that time Associate Justice William Rehnquist, and is now currently serving on our Supreme Court.
Oh gosh.
That's right, John. Did I hear you say Chief Justice John Roberts?
Yes, I was gonna say Roberts, but I wasn't sure if it wasn't who is Scalia's law clerk that's on there now?
That's the most recent would be Amy Coney Barrett,
Amy. Okay, I couldn't.
who was a young law clerk for Justice Scalia. And before
Yeah,
that,
I knew it was the chief, but I got a little twisted on who it might be. So that's
your performance, as always, is still highly commendable. We give you very high partial credit there. But it's the three zones. These are known in shorthand. The three zones of Jackson's concurrence.
can I
The first
jump
zone,
in here,
if you're the
Professor?
executive, go ahead, John.
Professor?
Absolutely.
Can I jump in real quick? I'm trying to get back to my notes of the questions that were asked, but I can't seem to find them. There we go. So there were a couple of quick questions that you might want to address if you can. The first one was, somebody wants to know why you didn't address Korematsu, because they felt like that also had a national security aspect. And then someone wanted to know how Truman's action interacts with the takings clause.
Yes. So with respect to the first, Korematsu, the short answer is it's just in the interest of time. In my class that I teach to students at Boston University, we spend a lot of time on Korematsu. It's a great case. And the only reason I didn't include it is just because of time, but you're absolutely right. And I think it's most recently that the Supreme Court formally overruled the Korematsu decision. And again, just to review the highlights of that case, that is when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by executive order, issued internment of Japanese Americans, affecting over 100,000, who were sent to relocation camps in the United States. And that was done solely on the basis of his executive power. And the United States Supreme Court upheld that use of executive power. So thank you for bringing it up. And I'm sorry that I didn't address it. I'm sorry, John, the second question was with respect to
the seizure of the steel mills. How does that interplay with the takings clause?
Yes. And the answer to that is exactly what Justice Douglas said. That was Justice Douglas's opinion. That's William O. Douglas, his concurrence. He said, this is a taking It's an out and out taking, and we have to follow the Constitution on that. That was his view, but that view was not, I think he had a majority of one. I don't think any of the other justices joined in that analysis, but that was clearly Douglas's take. Thank you for those questions. Are there any others, John? We're good to go?
That's it for now.
Okay, but yeah, as they say, keep those questions coming. So these are the three zones. If you're the executive, you want to be in zone one because that's where you have your most power, right? And you can see the text there. I explained. I used some math here, E plus C. That's where the executive is empowered with Article 2 authority as well as congressional authority. Zone 2, you can see that is arguably overlapping power. You could think of the Venn diagrams overlapping. And then the third zone is where you do not want to be if you're the executive. That is where you are acting in a way that is not compatible with Congress. Okay. So those are the three zones. And what I want to do now is take the still seizure case and see how that's been applied by subsequent courts. Okay. And now we are going to fast forward to the Iran hostage crisis, which I suspect many members of the audience today will remember the 444 days when American diplomats were kept hostage in Tehran. Oh, sorry, this is my summary of the still seizure case here. Yeah, again, they had a different approach to ex parte contacts. And, you know, Harry Truman did like his bourbon. He was a good bourbon drinker. I don't think Hugo Black was any stranger to America's favorite whiskey either. But they did meet and they made amends. I think Truman still thought they were wrong, but so be it. And now I want to talk about Dames and Moore case, which some of you might remember. Again, this is going to the Ronald Reagan administration to give you the historical context. So to summarize, basically 4 broad categories of the president's national security power that I put in 4 bins for you. And just keep that in mind as we talk about Dames and Moore versus Reagan. Again, this is the Reagan administration. Some of you might remember that is not a misspelling of Ronald Reagan. That is actually the correct spelling of Donald Regan, who at that time was the Secretary of the Treasury in the Reagan administration. Okay. So with respect to the facts, in practical terms, Dames and Moore was a major engineering and construction company. They had provided about $3 million worth of services to the government of Iran when the Shah was in power, when the Shah of Iran ruled. Dames and Moore had not been paid for those services. To put that in financial perspective, $3 million in 1981 is probably worth about $11 million today. So not an insignificant amount of money, okay? Now, as we know historically, the Shah is overthrown and Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. Shortly afterwards, the Iranians overran the American embassy in Tehran, taking American diplomats and embassy staff hostage. Well, Dames and Moore owed $3 million. Since they owed the money, they went to United States court. They got a judgment for $3 million. Armed with this judgment, they wanted to attach property that would belong to the government of Iran. The government of Iran had assets in the United States, bank accounts and so on. Those had been frozen by executive order of then President Jimmy Carter, okay? Now, what President Ronald Reagan did was he had issued an order that nullified attachments against Iranian property entered by US courts. He required that the transfer of such claims from US courts go to a newly created international arbitration tribunal, okay? And again, Ronald Reagan used executive orders to do that. Well, Dames and Moore doesn't like that because they want to claim assets of Iran that are in the United States. So what would you do? They go to court. In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the actions by the Reagan administration, and they dismissed the $3 million lawsuit brought by Dames and Moore, which was filed to basically recover a debt that had been incurred by the government of Iran. Okay. The court approves the suspension of claims that was filed, even though there's no specific statutory provision that authorized the step. Now, if you look at your Constitution, if you look at Article 3, Section 2, I'm neglectful in that I don't have my Constitution handy at the moment, but if you look there in Article 3, Section 2, you'll find that it is Congress that can make exceptions to the jurisdiction of Article 3 courts, not the executive. It is Congress that makes exceptions to the jurisdiction of Article 3 courts. So that was what Dames and Moore had argued. This is unconstitutional because the president did it, not Congress. Congress examined various statutes and concluded that they did not give the president the authority to suspend claims. They looked at what's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. They also looked at the Hostage Act of 1868. They found that it did not apply. I should note, I kind of buried the lead here. Writing the opinion of the Dames and Moore Court was William Rehnquist. William Rehnquist, who had been that young law clerk to Robert Jackson and admired him and loved him greatly. Okay. But Rehnquist looks at the Hostage Act of 1868, and he found it did not apply. Now, the Hostage Act of 1868, it was extraordinarily important legislation in the 19th century. It's now gone the way of one of the old chestnuts. In the 19th century, many foreign nations recognized the idea or the principle of perpetual allegiance. If, for example, you were born in Ireland during British Empire, when Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, you were perpetually a citizen of the United Kingdom, similarly with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and others. Well, what did that mean? Why do we care? Well, America is a melting pot. A lot of people from those European countries came to the United States, became US citizens. When they would go back to visit the old country, what would happen? They would be conscripted into military service because they were still regarded as citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, citizens of the United Kingdom, etc. Their American citizenship was not recognized. Says Hostage Act isn't on point. However, Rehnquist makes the argument, and again, I think you find this in Justice Jackson's zones, just because Congress did not delegate authority specifically to the president does not mean or imply congressional disapproval of the action taken by the executive. Okay. And he cites the Justice Jackson in the Youngstown decision that the legislature could have intent to give the president broad discretion such that he may be considered to invite measures of independent presidential responsibility. Okay. And Rehnquist also notes that Congress has in no way disapproved the action that Ronald Reagan has taken, even though many congressional hearings have been held on this matter. Okay. Let's back up and try to see what I think is the larger political picture and frankly, the more relevant one, especially from an international relations standpoint. So if you bluntly ask what's going on here, well, in practical terms, the U.S., Dames and Moore is owed their $3 million, but in practical terms, we're talking about $8 billion in U.S. claims that are going to go to this tribunal that the government of Iran, the United States have agreed to establish. Okay, so this is serious money. Dames, you know, that was obviously a drop in the ocean, only $3 million. But if the court had decided differently, the US would have been in breach of an executive agreement with Iran. And that might have had very debilitating consequences for future foreign relations, let alone Iran, right? I would note the court was under tight time deadlines. Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote this opinion in 8 days, not weeks, not months, 8 days. And it was an 8-1 decision. So basically, I think you could look at this as the court very realistically is facing enormous political pressure to, quote, make it come out right. And I guess all of us can remember the Iranian, or many of us can remember the Iranian hostage crisis. That occupied a great deal of the American people's attention. It received perpetual media attention. And I think you'll recall that actually was a contributing factor in President Carter's re-election defeat. If the court had said and agreed with Dame's argument that the president's action was unconstitutional, again, I think it would have had a very drastic effect on future agreements a president would make with foreign countries, because a foreign country would be very reluctant to enter into executive agreements because they would say, your court is just going to overturn it. I would also say that foreign governments would probably perceive the system as being rigged by saying that, okay, Mr. President, you can agree with me now in this executive agreement, but I know exactly what you're going to do. You're going to have your court overturn it and it'll be useless. Okay. Now, the legal criticism of this decision, as the court got it wrong. Legally, it's very arguable that Congress ever authorized the president to make this kind of far-reaching decision with respect to the jurisdiction of an Article III court. Okay, but that's Dames and Moore. Again, I think it is very important to note it was written by William Rehnquist. And again, an 8-1 decision. I think the court was keenly aware of the international relations implications with which they were dealing. And we talked about this. I want to talk now a case that involves foreign relations called Zivotofsky. Some of you might know this. I can put the facts up here for you. I'll give you a second to read it. And this is a review of your recollection skills here. So Zivotofsky is the child that was born in Jerusalem. His parents bring this lawsuit on his behalf since he is a minor. Now, the name Kerry should be familiar to you. That is John Kerry, who at that time was the Secretary of State. Justice Kennedy, writing the opinion for the majority, acknowledges Jerusalem as a delicate subject. This is not a class on the Middle East by any means, but suffices to say that both the Israelis and the Palestinians claim Jerusalem as their capital. I would note that the situation has changed during the Trump administration, when President Trump moved the United States Embassy, which had been located in Tel Aviv, when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and President Trump formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Prior to the Trump administration, the embassy had been in Tel Aviv, and the United States kind of dealt with a dual policy. Okay. Now, it is interesting. This is my way of poking a little bit of fun at Justice Kennedy. And he's right. The United States is having sovereignty over Jerusalem. It is interesting because the congressional act was actually entitled United States Policy with regard to Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So at least we could, fair to say, Congress had a very different idea. And note that it was an act, which means that a president signed it into law. Okay. Now, this is where we want to bring in the zones of Justice Jackson. We want to bring in the zones of Justice Jackson. Sorry. Because we want to ask ourselves, what zone is the president in? Remember, we have the 3 zones. Ideally, if you're the president, you want to be in zone 1, executive plus congressional. Zone 2, zone 3 is actually where the president is acting contrary to explicit or implicit acts to Congress. Doesn't this sound a lot like zone 3? Congress has said, if your child is born in Jerusalem, you can have Israel put on the passport. It's the executive branch that says, no, we put Jerusalem. Okay. That's the conflict here. The Zivotofskys, child's born in Jerusalem, they're citing the congressional act that says we can have Israel put down as the place of birth on the US passport. That contradicts what is in the FAM, F-A-M Foreign Affairs Manual, which is published by the State Department. So that is official executive branch policy. The FAM, the Foreign Affairs Manual, the executive guidance, executive regulation requires that Jerusalem be put as the place of birth, not Israel. That's a conflict, right? Okay. The president's in zone 3. Well, interestingly, what does the Supreme Court hold? By a 6-3 vote, we have 3 dissenters, Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Alito, and Justice Scalia. Court finds that Section 15D, which is the relevant part of the congressional statute, says you can put Israel. They find that unconstitutional. It's an unconstitutional infringement on the president's recognition power in foreign affairs. Essentially, the reasoning, the president has the recognition power. This power includes the power to recognize a foreign sovereign. It is exclusive to the president. Congress cannot command the president to contradict his earlier recognition decision, citing the reception clause, Article 2, Section 3, and Article 2, Section 2. And why is this power exclusive to the president? There, the court engages in what are largely functional considerations. It's the president that engages in diplomatic matters in ways that Congress cannot. A lot of that going back to the reasoning in the Curtis Wright case about the president deals in classified information. He has delicate deliberations with foreign powers and so on. The idea of one voice, speed, discretion, secrecy. But they leave what I would call wiggle room. That's not a very legal appropriate term. They leave wiggle room by saying, well, there is a role for Congress in foreign affairs, but they don't really tell us what that is. Now, for the dissenters, how do they deal with this? Chief Justice Roberts, I think, cleverly just says, this case isn't about recognition. This case is about identification. Identification of an American citizen, where that American citizen is born. So he kind of defines it away. In that case, if it's about identification, where you're born on your passport, that's a matter for the executive. It is Justice Scalia who more directly takes on the majority. He basically views the foreign affairs power as not at all an exclusive power of the president. So there's a power that Congress and the president share. Congress has made its view very, very clear. Scalia bemoans what he calls functionalism that the Supreme Court has engaged in. I think by that he means they're basically looking at political considerations. In his view, this is bad because that means future courts are going to be too likely to side with the executive branch in matters pertaining to foreign policy. Okay, but that is Zivotofsky in a very rough nutshell. And like I said, in some ways, I guess because of President Trump's decision to move the embassy, we won't see similar cases. And just to kind of, in the time remaining very quickly, other citations to the still seizure case. Medellin was an important case because this is where a Mexican was convicted of murder by a Texas state court. The United States is a signatory to the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. This means that if you are a citizen of Mexico, in this case, the Mexican consulate is to be notified of the arrest of a Mexican citizen. That wasn't done by the state of Texas when they had this case. It's arguable if they even knew there was a Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, okay? So you can see what happened here with bullet number 3. Medellin files for writ saying, my rights were violated under this treaty obligation that the United States honors. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals dismissed the application as an abuse of the writ, saying that he did not raise the Vienna Convention in a timely manner. And here, the court finds that there's no constitutional violation, that Texas was acting within its proper jurisdiction in its trial and conviction of Medellin. And the explanations here. And what's great about this opinion is how Robert structures it to Justice Jackson's concurrence in the still seizure case. Again, it's, I guess, Roberts is the grand law clerk of Jackson, right? Jackson to Rehnquist to Roberts. And he cites the still seizure case as part of his framework in his decision to uphold what the Texas court had done. And I'm just going to go over this very quickly so we have some time for questions. This is a case concerning detainees at Guantanamo. This was the height of Iran and Afghanistan. Hamdan brought a case against that was Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. And this was a Supreme Court decision that found that Hamdan could not be persecuted and tried by a military commission. What's interesting in this case is that in dissent, that just Clarence Thomas cites to Youngstown richly. And I'll give you a chance to read that. And I would note, in terms of practical considerations, rather than Hamdan having his stay before a United States court, the executive branch made the decision to return him to Yemen. So he didn't have to worry about any court, any civilian court hearing his case. Maybe the executive branch didn't have to worry about any civilian court hearing his case. And more recently, there have been other citations to the still seizure case in briefs and so on, but just to share this with you, where the still seizure case is quoted before a federal judge. You'll remember the travel ban enacted in the Trump administration. This was colloquially known in the media as the Muslim ban. Here in his argument before the federal district court judge, Youngstown is cited by the Department of Justice attorney. So I think in the interest of time, I'll stop there and I will ask my colleague, John Kohler, if we have any questions or comments from my fellow Virginia State Bar
Yeah.
members.
Can you hear me? Am I on?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, good. I couldn't see myself.
Yes.
So an interesting comment was somebody says the Kingdom of Morocco still recognizes the principle of perpetual allegiance. So if you have any Moroccan friends, don't let them go back home.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. And the attorney who submitted it might know. I think there are other countries as well that recognize that principle.
Yeah, I actually have a friend whose father was a Brazilian citizen, and even though he was born in this country, before he turned 18, he had been home to visit relatives. When he turned 18, he couldn't go back to Brazil because he would have been conscripted.
Yeah, and
So,
just a little bit of an aside, at Boston University, we have a large group of Korean students who study internationally. Korea has very strict national service for men, right? So a lot of them, if they stay here, this is something they have to be very mindful of.
yeah. So one question was, to what extent does the steel seizure case lay the groundwork for the majority in Hamadan versus Rumfield in 2005?
Okay, that's a great question. And really, I can't give an authoritative answer on it. The excerpt I showed was for the dissent, right? Showing Clarence Thomas's views. But sorry to disappoint the questioner. Now, it could well be we have someone here that could give an authoritative answer to the question.
And then another comment saying, what would stop a future president from reversing, as there is no stare decisis in the executive branch? And I think referring to that last case you were discussing.
With respect to, I'm sorry, which case, John?
I'm not sure, because they didn't say in the question itself, but it was toward the end of your discussion.
Oh, right. Yeah, right. I think that's a very good point. I would also note, in fairness, I didn't say this with the travel ban. Recall, by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court did uphold the travel ban that Trump initiated as lawful. Right.
Yeah, and I think what they're saying
is,
and I think the answer to the question is, well, if another president reverses an executive order or the effect, which I think the current president is doing,
happens all the time.
It happens all the time. There's no stare decisis. I think that was their point, was
right.
when you have a change of administration, lots of things change.
Yeah, I think President Biden's issued several. Most recently, he's not permitting Department of Defense funding to be used to fund the wall and other structures along our southern border. That's the most recent example of that.
So we just had a question come in. Is the travel ban case justification used by President Biden to ban travel from India right now? I'm pretty sure he's using some other health immigration directive.
This is the COVID. And recall, COVID was also invoked in dealing with I guess we're not allowed to call it a crisis, the situation on the southern border, right? Because of COVID-19. I think the Trump administration enacted stricter measures as far as that border control. And I think they've been carried out and continued by the Biden administration as well. But presumably some type of public health nexus.
Yeah, I think we've had a comment here that apparently the authority is.
And the bottom line, I think you all know this now because of COVID.
Yeah, 8 USC 1182F, which is the Border Control Act under Title 42, or it could be the Title 42. And the Surgeon General has the authority under that. If you would very quickly just turn control back over to me so that we don't forget to do that.
I like my brief moment.
You don't want to give up power, huh?
I felt like Harry Truman seizing control of the still industry. I had control of the CLE class for a fleeting moment.
You still have it, actually. I think you have to stop sharing your screen. Maybe
got
first.
it. I made you the host.
Okay.
See if you're the host.
I think I probably am now.
Okay. Yeah. I guess you overturned me like the Supreme Court with Harry.
Yeah. I also think I found out how to, it's apparently under sharing screens where I could have given you the power to share while still retaining the power to mute. So I appreciate whoever it was that said to do that. It's just I didn't realize it was under a different menu option.
John, look at it this way. It was an apt metaphor for giving me such immense unilateral control for our discussion of this still seizure case.
So at this point, we are just a few minutes shy of 2 hours, but of course we round up. So everybody who was on at 2 or even as late as 2:15, you've got your 2 hours. I'm sure the professor is happy to stay online to discuss or answer questions, which you can do through chat, or you can now unmute, since we are no longer worried about hearing conversations that we probably shouldn't have been party to. I don't know. At least there was no profanity this time. I can't remember if who was online for that particular course where we had a rather interesting somebody was having difficulty with Zoom and was expressing their frustration. So there's a comment here, makes me want to go back to law school. Were you going to post the site to donate to again? Yeah, you can do that. You can actually just go directly to the Madison County Rescue Squad site if you want to give directly, or you can give through the VMVLA. And I should mention, I think it actually says this on the website. We round up the donations. We don't you know, they charge you a little fee for that, and a lot of places say please add $2, but we don't do that. We round it up. They get every dollar because, you know, we're a 501 C6 organization, and we zealously defend our status as not for profit. So we don't mind giving the extra, you know, 12 or 13 cents per $10 or whatever it is. And we'll be making that donation to the Madison County Rescue Squad as soon as I get the final total. And we really do appreciate people who do that, because you know, we do these for free because there are people who honestly I think appreciate that aspect of it. But those of you who recognize the value of these and want to support it by making those donations, we really do appreciate you. So go ahead and unmute if you want to ask questions or just have a discussion. We'll stay online as long as there's interest. But also, I should mention I'm making dinner for my family tonight, so I'll have to sign off at some point. How can I determine when I signed on? If you're not sure, send me an email and I'll check the Zoom logs and let you know, Sam. And but you know, hopefully your own memory will help you know that. Fantastic presentation. I greatly appreciate it. Thanks, Tom.
I was very happy to see there's someone in the audience that's from Madison County.
Yeah, I saw that too. Yeah, somebody points out you've got a timer actually on your screen there. I think if you look at the may depend on whether you're on the app or not. And I think you have to go full screen to see it or something, but yeah, there actually is a timer there. Well, what is the next CLA that VMVLA will be doing? That's our Memorial Day. Memorial Day, we've got Brandy Despinett Albrecht coming back to do the second of our veterans rights courses. This one is actually going to be a little bit more. The other one was like an overview course. This one's going to be specifically on representing clients to get their disability benefits, for which you have to be qualified. But that is a 2-hour CLE. We just got the approval. 6:15. where, where are you, Sam? 6:15. Anyway, yeah, I will. Let me just make a note, and I'll make sure to let you know what your total time and attendance was. I'll just write that down now, so I'm not. Attending. Okay. Yeah, somebody says you can also look to see when your first chat was. Oh, you're in West Africa? Wow. Yeah, the recording will be available. I will try and get it uploaded tonight. But I also, of course, have to go through and verify all the attendance logs. So if I don't get it up tonight, I'll definitely get it tomorrow. But usually I can, it's kind of an automated process to get it converted to the YouTube format, and it takes a long time, but if I get it started, I can usually get it uploaded the same night. Given the intensity of this subject, I think people may be a little bit have their minds blown to want to discuss it. I will mention that you said I'm something of a Supreme Court history buff too. Many years ago, when I was in law school, I actually won the Hamilton Prize for Legal History for writing a paper on the German denaturalization cases of World War I, which of course played into the Korematsu decision later. And then I also wrote a paper about Korematsu for a seminar class, in which I compared the decisions, not just Korematsu, but the whole internment situation, and how there were decisions both before and after the war, and how essentially, without going into too much detail, the decisions made while the war were going on were much more deferential to executive power. And then once the war was over, the court definitely started backing away. And we don't like to think of the court as being influenced by the current events, but clearly they have to be. And I think that was also probably a lesson that they took away from the habeas corpus situation in the Civil War. We don't think that Lincoln actually said it, but the apocryphal quote of, he has his decision, now let him enforce it. During a time of war, I'm not sure the Supreme Court can really tell the president to do much of anything. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of thank yous in the comments, but I'm not seeing any substantive questions. So we'll probably sign off here at 4:10 if we don't have anybody coming up with anything. Would like to remind everybody that after our firearms CLE at the end of June, we take a little break along with the Supreme Court and of the United States and the Supreme Court of Virginia. We take a summer hiatus, and we'll be back for our fall seminar. What agency did John work for? Well, shh. It was one with 3 initials, and it wasn't the FBI or the NSA or the FCC. I guess they all have 3 initials, don't they? Did you want to respond to that question, Professor?
This is where I either take the Fifth Amendment, or that's another CLE class we could do, or I can neither confirm nor deny. No, I spent roughly 30 years supporting the federal government. 21 of those years were with the Central Intelligence Agency. My own particular training was as an operations officer. I did spend several years at the Department of Defense as an office director working with biometric technology. And I spent about 8 years at the RAND Corporation as an analyst doing Department of Defense related work.
Yeah, I had a professor in college who had the wonderful name of he was Professor Cosmos. His last name was Cosmos, and he was called in to do some consulting for the NSA, and wound up parceling out some of the research work to his students. I'm not sure that that was part of the intention of the NSA, but that's as close as I ever got to any kind of clandestine work. I of course worked for the state for all of my career. So so I was going to mention, in addition to our online service that we'll be doing, as we did for the first time, the Zoom virtual seminar in the fall last year because of COVID. We're going to keep that up because it was so successful, but we are having the delayed organizational meeting in Harrisonburg, October 21st to 24th. Elise is going to be there. We're going to have a great CLE with her, covering a lot of the topics that people wanted to talk about during her CLE, but we only had an hour. We've got, I think we're looking at, I think, between 7 and 9 hours of live CLE and 16 to 18 hours overall. So I know a lot of you have been with us all year, taking as many of our courses as you can. So you're probably pretty close to your 12 hours already, but no reason you can't get ahead. And if you're in Virginia close enough to come to Harrisonburg, when we start registering people for that, we'd love to meet some of you in person. All right, so we're almost at 4:10. We're down to only about, now I will say, I think the weather may have played into this. Did you put the CL link credit link in chat? Yes, I did, but I'll do it again just in case anybody still needs that. And of course, it'll be in the email that you receive confirming attendance as well. Because we had about 400 signed up, but only about 210 I think was our top login. So I think the beautiful weather, because it is gorgeous, at least where I am. A lot of people said, you know, I really don't want to do CLE on a Saturday when I could be out. It's here in Roanoke, it's the just beautiful blue skies at 72, which, considering we had a couple of days in the middle of the week when it was in the 90s, actually 90s at the end of March, I can't, you know, I would rather have 40-degree temperature in March than 90. I can barely tolerate it in the middle of the summer. All right, I don't see any additional comments or questions or anything, so I'm going to go ahead, since, as I said, I'm cooking dinner tonight, and in the meeting I have that power. But again, our great thanks to Professor Woodward and to everyone who supports the VMVLA and what it is we're trying to do. It's 60s here in Texas. Somebody said. Okay. All right, folks. Hope to see a lot of you at the end of the month, and if not, then either at the end of June or in October. And everybody else have a wonderful weekend and enjoy the rest of May, and we'll see you then. Bye.